Hello everyone, welcome to the Catch-Up Wales for GCSE Biology. I'll now hand you over to Mrs. Cedar, who will be presenting the first session for us. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon everyone, my name is Mrs. Cedar and as you know we're going to do the first session today for the biology topic. We're going to look at genetic crosses and constructing Punnett squares. So this is going to be our first session in a series of 4. I'm just going to run through some introductions to the session. So the session is 40 minutes long. There is a Q&A facility that you can use in the top right-hand corner. So if there's anything that you don't understand or anything you want me to go back over, then feel free to put it in the Q&A and we'll try and get back to you and make sure that that is sorted. In terms of the task that we're going to be doing today, the first bit of the session is going to be looking over the actual content that you need to learn for the biology GCSE for this topic. And then we're going to look at some specific examples. So even though in an ideal world we'd give you more time to actually be able to sit down and do these questions, due to the nature of the webinar, I'm going to ask you just to have a little think about the answer that you would give, maybe on a piece of paper, start making notes, and then I will then tell you when the time is up and we will go over it. I do apologise in advance if we go through this quite quickly, but we only have 40 minutes, and that means that we have to make sure that we cover what we need to in the time that we've got, okay? This recording will be available to you after the session, and you can go back and rewind it and pause it and work through it at your own pace. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to cover a couple of topics today in terms of the DNA and inheritance biology topic in the GCSE. So we're going to do a quick recap on what DNA is. We're going to look at how that relates to chromosomes, and then we're going to introduce you then to alleles. We're going to look at some of the key vocabulary that we've got with this topic. So we've got some important keywords that you need to know. So genotype and phenotype are 2 important keywords that they use in the GCSE question. So we need to know what they are. Heterozygous and homozygous are 2 other important words that we need to get across today, and they use these quite a lot in the GCSE questions. So although you may not be asked to define these words, it is important to know what they are and how that relates to the question. And we're going to look at some questions today where we use those words. Then we're going to start looking at our Punnett squares, and I'm going to work through some examples, some easy examples to start with, and then we'll look at some real past paper questions then in terms of our review. Okay, right. This first slide, which you might want to take a little screenshot of or take a picture with your camera, is all the specialist words for this topic. As you can see, there's quite a lot of them. So I would say for this type of task, one nice task that you might want to do after the session is maybe create some flashcards. Okay, so on one side you would have the specialist term, on the other side you're going to have the definition. And that's a nice little activity that you can do for this topic, because there is lots of key language that you need to learn for this topic. In some GCSE papers, you may be asked to actually define these words. So if I think off the top of my head, I've seen a question before where you had to define what a gene was or what an allele was, okay, or what they mean by a recessive or a dominant allele. Okay, so in those cases, you would actually have to learn the definition, okay, as it is. And what I've done is I've taken the exact wording from the specification from the WJC, so you know that if you learn this definition, this is the one that's going to get you the marks. So even if they don't ask you in a GCSE question to define the word, it's really important that you know what these words mean, because if they use the word phenotype in a question, like what is an organism's phenotype, then obviously you need to know what the word phenotype means in order to actually answer the question. So I'm not going to go through each of these because you can read them and you can go through and learn them, but we're going to approach some of these as we move through the PowerPoint slide today. Okay, First thing that we're going to look at then is DNA, chromosomes and genes. What is the relationship between these three things? First thing we've got to think about is where our genetic material is found. Our genetic material is found in the nucleus of a cell. So this here is our nucleus. Get my pointer out. Okay, so this is the nucleus of the cell, and we can see inside then we have chromosomes. This is an individual chromosome, so this would be one. And if we were to pull the end of that chromosome, it would unravel and it would be made up of a chemical called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, and we can see here that if we take a section of that DNA, that's what we understand to be a gene, a section of DNA. Chromosomes are arranged in pairs like this. Okay, and often you will see diagrams whereby the chromosomes are sat side by side in order. Okay, so from 1 to 23. So human body cells, that's important to remember, have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Why do we have 23 pairs? Because we inherit one chromosome from our mum and one from our dad. Okay, so we have 23 pairs. We get 23 individual chromosomes from our mum, and we get 23 individual chromosomes from our dad. And we can see here that the banding on those chromosomes is similar because the chromosomes have the same genes on them. Not the same versions of the genes, but the same genes. At the bottom here, we can see chromosomes that look different. The 23rd pair of chromosomes is your sex chromosomes. So these are the ones that determine whether you are male or female. If you inherit two X chromosomes, then you are female. If you inherit an X and a Y, then you are male. So it is these chromosomes here that determine whether you are female or male. Now, I've just put in a little bit of information there. Now you have to learn that there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in human body cells. The exam board will expect you to know that fact. So in other words, we have 46 chromosomes in our cells. Here we are, Homo sapiens, down the bottom here. However, other species, different species, have different numbers of chromosomes. And the exam board can give different examples of different organisms, and you would have to be able to tell them how many chromosomes are in their body cells or how many chromosomes are in their sex cells. And that's going to be something that we're going to look at in next week's session on mitosis and meiosis, cell division. Does that mean I have to learn the number of chromosomes for every species there is on Earth? Of course not. Okay, we need to make sure that we can use the information that's given by the exam board, and that we'll be able to use that number, in order to work out how many chromosomes are in, for example, a roundworm's body cells and how many would be in its gametes, for example. Okay, so we just got to know how to use the information that we're given. You do need to learn, however, that human body cells have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, we've looked at genes already. Genes are sections of DNA molecules that determine inherited characteristics. So it's our genes that give us blue eyes or ginger hair. Okay, so our genes are what determine our characteristics that we inherit from our parents. And as we saw in the last slide, here is a gene. Okay, it is this genetic code here that will determine a particular protein, and that protein then will determine our characteristics. Okay. All right. Let's look at the genes that we have then. Humans have 2 copies of each gene. Okay. We have 2 copies of each gene because we inherit one from our mum and one from our dad. So we have 2 copies of every single gene. If I go back to this slide here, you can see, let's say this is a particular gene, and we have 2 copies of that specific gene, one from our mum and one from our dad. Okay. A version or form of a gene is called an allele. An allele. Okay, you do need to know how to spell that word. Okay, so a version or form of a gene is called an allele. And sometimes you're asked to define that word in an exam. Now, in a pair of chromosomes, when I mean pair, I mean one from mum, one from dad. In a pair of chromosomes, there may be two different alleles of a particular gene, or the two alleles may be the same. So for example, here is child 1, let's say. Okay, and child 1 has inherited this capital letter gene, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. Okay, so they've inherited allele 1 from mum, but they've inherited a different allele from dad, a different version of that gene. Okay, so the different versions carry not different letters, but whether it's capital or lowercase. Okay, so they inherit one version from mum and a different version from dad. That's one example. Let's look at another example. So this child has inherited that, we're going to call it a dominant allele, we'll look at what that is in a second, from their mum, but also the same allele from their dad. And then child 3 has inherited the recessive allele, and we'll look what that means in a second, from their mum, and the same recessive allele from their dad. Okay, so humans have 2 copies of each gene. Those alleles may be different or they may be the same. Okay, right, what we're going to do then is we're going to do a little quick quiz, and rather than write these answers in the chat, what I'm going to ask you to do then is just say the answer out loud. Obviously I can't check whether you're right, but you can check your answer then as the answer comes up on the screen. So my first question is, chromosomes are arranged in what? Chromosomes are arranged in what? Okay, say your answer out loud. The answer, pairs. You were right. Okay, Diane. So chromosomes are arranged in pairs. How many versions of each gene do humans have? How many versions? Say your answer out loud. Okay, they have 2 versions. So if you said 2 versions, then you were right. A version of a gene is called an what? Say it out loud. A version of a gene is called an allele. So if you said allele, Diane, you were right. Excellent. Okay, we're going to move on to monohybrid inheritance. Now that looks quite complicated. What does it actually mean? Well, let's break the word down. Mono, meaning one. Whenever I teach my students about that word mono, we've heard monomer. There's lots of words in science where we use mono, we mean one, as in monobrow. Okay, so mono means one. Monohybrid inheritance. So it's got to be something to do with the number 1. And we're talking about inheritance which involves just one single gene. Okay, so at GCSE, when you go on to A-level, it's a bit different. But at GCSE, we focus on monohybrid inheritance, which is the name given to the inheritance of just one single gene. And the reason for that is to make it a bit more simple. Okay, so that it's easier to understand, we talk about inheritance of a single gene. But it's important to remember, and this is something that's important as you move forward in terms of exam questions, that hardly any human characteristic that we've got is controlled by a single gene. So it'd be lovely to think that the colour of your eyes was just determined by one single gene that we inherit from our parents, and there's 2 versions of that gene. But as we know, there's lots of colours of eyes, so that means that there must be different genes that are interacting with each other. Our characteristics are generally controlled by the interaction of many genes. So even though we're going to spend the rest of this lesson looking at monohybrid inheritance, and that's what they want us to do at GCSE, we have to understand that as humans, hardly any of our characteristics, things that how we look, are controlled by the interaction of just one gene. There are actually many genes working together. Okay. Right, let's have a look then at these alleles. Now, there are some characteristics caused by a single gene, monohybrid inheritance, And we're going to look at an example of that today. Okay, so I'm going to keep it really simple for you. So an example is fur colour in mice. Okay, so mice have 2 alleles for fur colour. Okay, so 2 versions of that gene. They either inherit genes that give them black fur, or they inherit the genes that give them brown fur. Alleles, to make it easier, can be represented with letters. And as we move through this lesson, hopefully we're going to start building up our understanding of this, and then we can bring it all together then to answer GCSE questions. Okay, so we're going to have 2 versions of our mouse. We're going to have our black fur mouse and we're going to have our brown fur mouse. Okay, right. So we've got our 2 keywords here. So this was our second learning intention. We're going to look at what phenotype is and genotype. Okay, so let's break these words down. So phenotype is the visible characteristic of an organism, which occurs as the result of its genes. So for example, in terms of the mice, it's either going to be black fur or brown fur. So if you're asked in an exam to give the phenotype, this is the visible characteristics that you can see, or as I'm going to show you an example later on, it could be a disease that they inherit, which obviously isn't a visible characteristic, but obviously someone would have symptoms of that disease. Okay, the way I like to remember it is it begins with PH. So I like to say it's like the physical characteristics, even though they're not all physical characteristics. Phenotype is the physical, phenotype, physical. Okay. Genotype then is the collection of alleles that determines the characteristics. So genotype is letters. Okay, here they are. Okay, so when you're asked for a genotype in an exam, if you're writing a sentence, you've done something wrong. Okay, if you are writing brown fur or black fur, then you've done something wrong. Genotype is always letters. It's the genes you inherit. Genotype, genes. Okay, so these are some exam clues. If they ask you to write the phenotype for an organism, they're asking for the physical characteristics. If they want the genotype for the organism, you are going to write down letters, capital letters, lowercase letters. Okay, right. Let's have a look at 2 new words now: dominant alleles and recessive alleles. Black fur is a dominant allele. So we give all dominant alleles a capital letter. In this case, we're going to use the letter B because we're going black and brown. Okay. In most exam questions, they will tell you what letter to use. But if it's a dominant allele or a dominant trait, then we always use a capital letter. Okay. If it is a recessive allele, so a weaker allele, okay, we always give a lowercase letter. Okay, we always, however, use the same letter. Okay, and I'm going to give you some examples later on where we show that you're going to use the same letter. Dominant alleles then will always show in the phenotype when present. Okay, so dominant alleles always show. So if you inherit just one of those dominant alleles from either your mum or your dad, you're going to show that characteristic. So all it takes is for the black mouse there to inherit one big B, one dominant allele, in order to be a black mouse. Okay, the brown mouse though, a recessive allele will only show in the phenotype. So remember, the phenotype is here, so you'll only be brown if he inherits 2 copies of the recessive allele. Okay, so he has to inherit the recessive allele from his mum and the recessive allele from his dad in order to be brown. Okay, so the recessive allele will only show when there are 2 recessive alleles. Okay, let's have a look at that then. So here we got our 2 mice. Okay, here's our black mouse. So the black mouse's phenotype is black fur. Okay, that's the characteristic he's inherited. That's the physical characteristic he's showing. The genotype, however, remember he inherits one from mum and one from dad. So a genotype will always be two letters together. So he could either be capital B, because he's inherited the dominant allele from dad and the dominant allele from mum, or he could be big B, small b, which means that he's inherited maybe the capital B from mum and the lowercase b from dad. So the dominant allele from mum and the recessive allele from dad. So the genotype of the black mouse can either be capital B, or capital B, lowercase b. The brown mouse then, his phenotype is, say it aloud to the screen, brown fur. And because he's got brown fur, his phenotype, his physical characteristic is brown. That means he must have inherited two recessive alleles from his parents, one from mum and one from dad. If he'd inherited a dominant allele from either his mum or dad, he wouldn't be brown. He can only have brown fur if he's inherited the two recessive alleles from his parents. Okay. Let's have a look at the quick quiz then. So we'll do it exactly the same as we did before. So I'm going to read out the question and you are going to say aloud the answer. Okay, so question 1, for a dominant allele to be expressed, dominant now, capital letter, how many copies of the allele are needed? For a dominant allele to be expressed, how many copies of the allele are needed? Say your answer aloud. 3, 2, 1. One copy. Only one copy is needed. So he could be big B, small b, or capital B, lowercase b, or he could be big B, big B. Okay. Question 2 then. For a recessive allele to be expressed, remember these are the lowercase letters now, how many copies of the allele are needed? So for a recessive allele to be expressed, how many copies of the allele are needed? Say your answer aloud. 3, 2, 1. 2 copies. Okay, so if you said 2 copies down, the combination, excuse me, the combination of alleles that cause the combination of alleles that cause our characteristic is called the, what do we call the combination of alleles? 3, 2, 1, that's the genotype. And the characteristic which is expressed, or the physical, visible characteristic which is expressed, is called the 3, 2, 1 phenotype. Okay, so down if you had those 4 right. So if you want to test yourself again, you can just go back in the video later on and go through those questions. Okay, let's have a look at 2 new words now. So we've done genotype, phenotype. We've done dominant and recessive. Now we're looking at homozygous and heterozygous. Now, these little prefixes here, you might have seen before, Homo sapiens, heterosexual. Okay, so these prefixes here are important and they help us remember what that means. So homozygous alleles means that you have inherited the same allele, meaning the same one from mum and the same one from dad. So when I mean that, I mean the dominant or recessive. Heterozygous, hetero means different. So heterozygous alleles mean that you have inherited different alleles from your mum or dad. Okay, so in the case of homozygous, this black mouse here would be classed as homozygous because he's got 2 dominant alleles. Homo meaning same, so he's inherited 2 copies of the dominant allele. But so is this brown mouse. He's also homozygous. But the black mouse is homozygous dominant because he's inherited 2 of the same dominant alleles. This brown mouse is inherited 2 recessive alleles. So he's homozygous recessive. Heterozygous then, this black mouse is heterozygous, meaning that he has two different versions of the allele. So he's inherited the dominant allele from dad or mum and the recessive allele then from the other parent. Okay, so homozygous meaning the same. So these two organisms are homozygous. This one is heterozygous, meaning he's inherited different different alleles. Okay, we're going to work through an example then using those new keywords. Okay, so like before, I'm just going to give you a short time to have a little think of your answer. Okay, I'm very conscious of the time. Got 15 minutes left. So we're going to work through these. The answer is going to come up. I'm going to count you down. Just say them aloud, and then you can always go back and do them on paper later on to test yourself. Okay, so Mendel was a very famous scientist that looked at inheritance, and one of the famous experiments that he did was to cross short pea plants with tall pea plants. Okay, so these are peas in a pod look, and these are the plants that they grow on. So short pea plants, so this one here, is caused by a recessive allele. So when I mean recessive allele, I mean a lowercase letter. Okay, so this is caused by a recessive allele. Tall plants is caused by a dominant allele using a capital letter. So this time we're using different letters, okay? And you can see here, unlike brown and black, which start with B, we've got tall and short, but we're not using a capital T for tall and a little s for short. We're using the same letter. That's important when you actually do these genetic crosses. You must use the same letter, but you just make the dominant trait capital letter and the recessive trait then the lowercase letter. So let's have a look at these. Question 1 then. What are the two phenotypes in this example? So what are the two phenotypes in this example? Pheno, physical, 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 what can you see? Okay, 3, 2, 1. One's tall, one's short. Okay, so the two phenotypes is tall plant, short plant. Question 2. What are the 3 possible genotypes? So what are the possible genotypes of the tall plant? Remember, genotypes is a combination of 2 letters. What are the genotype for the short plant? What are the 3 possible genotypes in this example? So using the letters T. 3, 2, 1. So you can have capital T, capital T, lowercase t, or lowercase t, lowercase t. Those are the 3 possible genotypes that could be available. What genotype must the short plant have? Well, the short plant is recessive. It's recessive. So we're using the lowercase letter for this one. It's recessive, so lowercase letter. And because recessive alleles only come when there is 2 copies of them, it must be lowercase t, lowercase t. Question 4. Will their genotype, so this one here, be heterozygous or homozygous? So is this heterozygous or homozygous? 3, 2, 1, homozygous, because homo means same. They've got the same alleles. Okay, question 5. What genotype could tall plants have? What genotype could tall plants have? Well, if we know that short plants are small t, 3, 2, 1. The genotype for tall plants must be capital T, capital T, or capital T, lowercase t. Okay, so again, if I've gone through this quite quickly, don't panic. All right, you can go back and have a look at these questions again. Okay, let's have a look at a Punnett Square. I'm very conscious of time. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to predict outcomes of genetic crosses. So we're going to cross our black mouse with our brown mouse. Okay, so when we draw a Punnett square, this is called a Punnett square, and this is what we use to actually cross our organisms and determine what chance is there of their offspring inheriting a certain characteristic. That's what we're doing with a Punnett square. Okay, we're using it to predict the outcome of their offspring. Okay, so when we talk about the male, he's a male black mouse. Okay, and I'm telling you that he is homozygous. Okay, homozygous. So this homozygous black mouse is going to be capital B, capital B. Okay, that's his genotype, capital B, capital B. Now, the reason we put them in boxes like this is because we're saying that these are the male gametes. These are the sperm cells that are going to join with the egg cells to produce their offspring. Okay, so remember, just one copy of the allele goes into each sperm cell. So all of his sperm cells are going to house the dominant allele. We're going to cross that then with our brown mouse, so the recessive allele. Okay, and because he's got a recessive allele, that means he must be she is small b, meaning that she's inherited 2 copies of the recessive allele. So her egg cells are all going to contain the recessive allele. To fill in these 4 boxes then, it's called a genetic cross, we cross them. Okay, so we say this sperm is going to join this egg in this box here to give us big B, small b, capital B, lowercase b. Okay, this sperm is going to join this egg in this box. Oh, sorry, went too far. This one, and then this one and this one. So we cross them. We're saying egg and sperm are meeting together to create offspring. So in this case, all of their offspring, all of their potential offspring are going to have black fur. And they're going to have black fur because they've inherited, all of their offspring are going to inherit the dominant allele. So that's where we bring in our numeracy, okay, and we give in a probability. So if we cross a dominant allele, a homozygous dominant allele with a homozygous recessive allele, then 100% of the offspring are going to inherit the dominant characteristic. Look at the next one. Okay. So this time we're going to cross a heterozygous black mouse. Hetero meaning different, meaning that he has inherited 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. So his sperm are either, so 50% of his sperm are going to contain the dominant allele, the other half are going to contain the recessive allele. If we cross him now with the female brown mouse, which is small b, let's have a look what the probability would be this time. So we cross them together. So big B, small b would give us black fur. Small b, brown fur. Big B, small b, black fur. Small b, brown fur. So in this case, there is a 50% chance that their offspring would either have brown fur or black fur. So because there's a 50% probability, the ratio is 1 to 1. It's 2 to 2, but we can simplify that, can't we, to 1 to 1. Okay, so if we cross a heterozygous organism with a recessive allele, so heterozygous dominant with a recessive allele, we're going to get the ratio of 1 to 1. 50% will inherit the dominant characteristic, 50% will inherit the recessive characteristic. Okay, in the last one then. This time we are crossing 2 black mice. Okay, so they're both heterozygous, so they're both going to be big B, small b. Okay. In this case then, big B would be black, big B, small b would be black, big B, small b would be black, and then small b would be brown. So in this case, there's a 75% probability of black fur and a 25% probability of brown fur, okay? Because remember, we've got 4 squares. Each of these squares is worth 25%, so 25, 50, 75% black, 25% probability of inheriting the recessive allele. Now look at this. Black mouse and black mouse can give rise to a brown mouse, okay? So it doesn't have to be that the parents are brown themselves to have an offspring that has brown fur, okay? It's because they carry the recessive allele as well that there's always going to be a 25% chance that their offspring is also going to have a phenotype that is recessive. So the ratio in this case is 3 to 1, 3 to 1. And often in an exam, you'll be asked to give a ratio. From that then, there are 3 common crosses that you might find to be useful. Now, ignore the fact that I've used a different letter this time, okay? It doesn't matter what the letter is, okay, as long as we're looking at the same idea. So in this case then, we're saying homozygous dominant mates with homozygous recessive. That means that 100% probability that they're going to display the dominant phenotype. So you can actually just learn these 3. And as long as you learn these 3, then you can pretty much do any genetic cross. A heterozygous organism mates with another heterozygous organism always gives a 3 to 1 ratio to dominant recessive phenotypes. Okay, so in the example of black and brown mice, 3 to 1 in terms of the dominant and recessive alleles. And then the last one is a heterozygous organism mating with a homozygous recessive organism will always give us a 1 to 1 ratio. Okay, so this here, I'll send out these PowerPoints, this will be available to you. This is a nice one to learn, okay, because these are the 3 versions that you will ever be asked in an exam. Okay, right, for the last 3 minutes, I'm going to go over a Mendel cross. So Mendel, as I said, was a famous scientist that looked at genetic crosses. In his genetic crosses, he used this version. He talked about a 1st generation cross and a 2nd generation cross. Okay, so in this case then, what we're saying is they mate the organisms first and they get their offspring, and then they take their offspring then and they mate those together, and we call that selfing. Selfing is a technique by which pollen from a plant is used to fertilize the same plant. Okay, so we're going to have a look at one of those genetic crosses now. So in the 1st generation cross, a homozygous tall plant, homozygous, same, homozygous tall plant is crossed with a short pea plant. Use a Punnett square to show that the offspring will be heterozygous. Note that the tall is the dominant allele shown with the capital letter. Okay, so we're crossing a homozygous tall plant, okay, with a short plant. Now in this question, they don't tell you whether it's homozygous or heterozygous, and that's because if it's a short plant, a recessive allele, it has to have the recessive, both of the recessive alleles. Okay, so in this example then, we're taking a dominant tall plant, homozygous, and we are going to cross it with a recessive homozygous short plant. So let's do that cross. So big T, small t, big T, small t, big T, small t, big T, small t. Okay, so that was that first rule, wasn't it? If you mate a homozygous dominant with a homozygous recessive, you're going to get 100% tall plants. Okay, so each one of these would be tall because they have the tall allele. Okay, they've inherited the tall allele. So 100% of these offspring would be tall. But then Mendel went on to then cross this tall plant with itself. Okay, so in the 2nd generation cross, or F2, so this is the 1st generation, this is the 2nd generation cross, the offspring were crossed or selfing. So they've taken the offspring and they've self-fertilized it. So tall plant versus tall plant. So if we're taking just the offspring, that means that both tall plants are going to be heterozygous. And in this case, then, we are crossing them together. So we're getting big T, big T, big T, small t, big T, small t, small t, small t. Okay, so in this example, then, in the second generation cross, we're getting a 3-to-1 ratio. Here's that 3-to-1 ratio again. 75% will be tall, 25% will be short. Okay, and this is how heterozygous, so tall plants, can give rise to short offspring. Okay, so in this example, then, this is just an example where we can see the 3-to-1 ratio. Okay, it's nearly the end, so I'm just going to show you how this would look in an exam, okay, and then we will finish, okay? So this is an exam question, just like the one that you saw, okay? It works exactly the same, but the only difference is this time is they tell you that they are purple flowers and white flowers, and we're using the letters capital D for purple, lowercase d to represent the white. Now it says, show this cross by completing the Punnett Square that all the offspring are going to be purple. Now, which of our 3 versions was it? Well, we need to make sure that we are crossing a homozygous dominant with a homozygous recessive. So that means all of the offspring are going to be heterozygous. They're all going to be purple. The next question then, it says, when Mendel selfed, so there's that word again, selfed the F1 generation, so this one here, this is the offspring, he obtained a ratio of 3-to-1. In the space, which is that, this Punnett square to the side, construct and complete the Punnett square. So we're mating this with itself, so big D, small d with big D, small d. So that gives us big D, big D, big D, small d, big D, small d, and then there it is, small d, small d. Here's the purple flower, purple flower, purple flower, and finally the white flower. Okay, so for this question then, it was worth 4 marks in an exam. Okay, right, we've come to the end of the session. I've run a little bit over, I do apologise. When these resources are sent to you, there are more examples, okay, and I would have loved the time. I was worried that I wasn't going to have enough for 40 minutes and I've gone way over. So when you get this PowerPoint, there's actually more examples to work through, okay? So feel free, the mark schemes are there, they come up. I've given you some ideas then in terms of some exam technique, okay? So you can pause the video when you see it, you can let the answers come in, you can test them yourselves, you can go back and watch this video again and work through the questions, okay? I hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you so much for joining into us. Next week, session 2 is going to be on cell division, so mitosis and meiosis, and hopefully you can join us then. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, and good night.